Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. I am delighted to have an old friend from the before times, as they say, Miles Taylor. Miles, if you do not know, was an official in the Bush administration, was an official in the Trump administration, rose to the level of DHS chief of staff, and then wrote a book, Anonymous. That sent him down a path in which he is now the subject of a legal confrontation with the Trump administration 2.0. Welcome, Miles. Thanks for joining us.
Jen, great to be here. Thank you for having me, and thank you for bearing with me while I'm at a sort of odd location. I'm charging the vehicle, and this was the best spot to post up in. And I will say, I bought this car 7 years ago before Elon went crazy. So I just want to
All
make
right,
that
but
point.
at least it's an EV, so that's a
That's right.
contrarian
Yeah,
act in these
yeah.
times. So good for you. Let's back up a little bit to Trump 1.0. Um, you were disturbed enough about things you witnessed there to write this book, Anonymous. What were some of the things that you described in that book that, of course, infuriated Donald Trump?
Well, look, the first thing I'll say is, you know, I still don't blame people for looking back in time and saying, "Well, why'd you do that anonymously?" And there was a very important reason, and that is I knew it would draw attention to this issue, and I knew that because as a student of history, if you go back in time and you look at what the founding fathers had to do to get people to pay attention to their sales pitch about the U.S. Constitution, they used the device of anonymity. And not because they were scared to speak out, but because they wanted it to be about the message and not the messenger. And it created a spectacle. They wrote these anonymous opinion pieces defending the Constitution. And so when I started to see things inside the Trump administration that I felt like very clearly should not be things that we kept among ourselves as underlings of the president, I knew that that device would work. It would draw attention to the message instead of Donald Trump trying to brawl with the messenger and get people to focus about the president's fitness for office. And Jen, that's what I wrote about because the president's own lieutenants, I would say about half of his cabinet at the time, would talk in private with me and others about how they felt like at best Donald Trump was unstable and at worst he was unfit for his job. So much so that cabinet members, and I of course was not a cabinet members talked a few times informally about the possibility that they might need to invoke the 25th Amendment of the Constitution. That's the amendment that allows the president's cabinet to declare that he's not able to execute his or her duties. That was to me really the breaking point. It was extraordinary to me that the president's own cabinet might be considering that they could end up in a situation where they would effectively have to pause him from his job. That's the type of thing I felt like the people who decide whether to fire or rehire a president, the voters needed to know about, not a bunch of unelected bureaucrats sitting there navel gazing about whether or not we were comfortable working for this man. And so, went out there and spread that message. But, after I put the opinion piece out, Jen, I just didn't feel like 800 words was enough to explain how serious this was. I could say a few things in that time opinion piece. And so I wrote the anonymous book to go out there and really delineate the defects in the president's character, but more importantly, his deep inclination towards illegality. And more than anything, I wanted to warn that if he won a second term, he would weaponize the powers of the executive branch for revenge. It was so clearly obvious to me 7 years ago that is what would happen. And unfortunately, it's exactly what we are seeing happen. And the last thing I'll say on that is, yes, I did the one thing that I knew would drive him the craziest, which when it comes to Donald Trump is telling the truth about who he really is.
Now, in none of this did you describe the substantive, confidential, secret nature of the things you were doing. This was not a policy book. This was not describing the day-to-day intrigue within the Department of Homeland Security. It was, however, talking about things that Trump did or believed. What were some of those things that we are seeing play out right now in real time?
Well, it's important, Jen, that you note the first part because the president is trying to pursue me because he claims that I published classified information in that book. Now, I will say up front, there is no classified information in A Warning. So if you bought that book hoping to find that, you didn't find it. In fact, what you found in the very first chapter, perhaps it was the first page, was me saying, if you come to look for those types of conversations, you're in the wrong place, because I know what my national security obligations are. Um, but 7 years ago, when I came forward against Donald Trump, his response immediately betrayed what his true intentions were. He wrote a 7-letter tweet in all caps, and he said, treason, question mark, because to him, personal criticism was subversive. And so, no, the book didn't contain sensitive information. I knew it couldn't, but I found it deeply ironic that Donald Trump, of all people, would use that as the argument against me speaking out against him, because it was he who left office several years ago, absconding allegedly with
Yes.
very highly classified information, the physical documents stacked in his basement. And I've been saying to people the past few weeks, does anyone think for a minute in my basement there are stacks of classified documents? You couldn't be so stupid. You know, if you do something like that and you work in the federal government, you go to prison. And so, when I set out to write that book, I knew I needed to talk about who he was and not the things that were transpiring behind closed doors that couldn't be disclosed. But that was much more important than any given episode that happened in the White House Situation Room or on Air Force One, because to me, it was the president's character that was going to determine the direction not just a second Trump administration would go, but the country would go, because he would very deeply imprint himself upon the federal government. No president in the history of this country has so assiduously tried to use the application of their personal whims towards governance. And so to me, his character was the thing that needed to be explained, and who he was in private needed to be the thing the American people understood if they were going to make a choice about whether to give the man a second term. And I think nothing has been clearer from this second Trump administration than the fact that that prediction, I think, bore out to be quite true, that the president's character has really driven the agenda. And Donald Trump has surrounded himself with people who let him be who he truly is.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things you describe is promising people they would be pardoned, for example. What are some of the other things that gave you pause to understand that he really didn't understand that he was there to execute the laws, defend the Constitution, but had this mentality that somehow he was a king and that he could do what he wanted with the apparatus of the federal government?
Well, the most important one, Jen, was his constant desire to use the tools of the Department of Homeland Security for personal reasons. And so he was always drawn to finding ways to leverage and weaponize the things we were doing at the Department of Homeland Security in his own favor. I'll give you specific examples. I mean, when I first came forward against Trump, the example I often pointed to was emergency aid, because we were constantly having to deal with Trump telling us after a wildfire or a hurricane or tornadoes that he wanted to withhold aid from a certain municipality because it was a blue state, it was Democrats, or it was a mayor that didn't like him. And he knew that he would get leverage there if he held back that money in a time of need. Uh, I'm a lifelong public servant and a conservative, by the way. And I saw this, and you just can't overstate how galling that is to be a public servant. It was my dream to work in the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11. And then we're dealing with a president who's telling us, hey, let's keep this money from people whose homes have burned down because I'm pissed at Governor Jerry Brown in California. That's not just wrong and immoral. That's illegal. You can't do that. And so we'd have to get in these conversations with Trump. And instead of focusing on the immediate crisis at hand, and the hundreds, maybe thousands of people who are suffering, you're preoccupied with one man trying to convince him why it's wrong to keep emergency aid from people. And the context that I would, put this in for folks is, I mean, just think about if you called 911 and you call 911 because there's a burglar in your home, and the first thing they say to you is, well, hey, before we dispatch a squad car, did you vote in the last election? That that's not okay. That's not how government is supposed to work. And so those were the types of things we saw day in and day out. And that's what I felt like people needed to know, is whether it was emergency aid, whether it was vindictiveness towards, a specific individual, that Trump was very inclined to use the powers of the presidency to his own personal political benefit. But I also flagged, the worry that he would use it to enrich himself, because that to me was why he had such an affinity for autocrats, or as I like to say, a weakness for strongmen, because he knew that in autocratic countries, you could get deals done. And I worry that I don't worry. It is so self-evident that right now we are seeing the president ingratiate himself with countries that could enhance his personal wealth. That is deeply, deeply disturbing to me, and it should be to any American, regardless of political party. No conservative should want a Democrat to win the White House or Bernie Sanders to come in and cut deals with, let's say, the Nordic countries that would personally financially enrich him. They would be apoplectic. And so we need to be apoplectic about the sitting president doing that.
And I think the difference between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0 is the things that you are describing, he now does openly. There's no pretext, there's no secrecy. Now, the latest episode in your encounters with Donald Trump was an executive order. What did that executive order say, and what has it done to your life since?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons one of the reasons I'm with you today, Jen, is to talk very openly about this. And this is something that my wife and I wrestled with for the past few weeks since the executive order, because you get a lot of well-intentioned people who in your life will say, hey, the best course of action right now is lay low. Maybe this is just symbolic. Maybe it blows over. Don't poke the bear. And I'm not going to lie. I mean, we considered that. We considered that because my wife and I have a young baby. We wanted to completely leave public life after the experience of several years ago, blowing the whistle on Trump. We just really wanted to lead a normal life. And then this happened, and we had to think about, what are the pros and cons of coming forward. But after a while, it became clear to us, if we cowered, if we didn't push back against this, that would be effectively us saying this is okay. It's okay to sign executive orders like he did on April 9th, ordering a revenge investigation into me and my former colleague, Chris Krebs. Our only crimes, as far as I know, were speaking the truth about the president. In Chris's case, he said that the 2020 election was one of the most secure in American history, which was contrary to what Donald Trump was saying publicly at the time. In my case, I, of course, had been criticizing his mismanagement of the federal government. And for that, he has pledged for years that he would exact revenge against us. He has said it was treason. And then he signed this on April 9th, and at the desk in the Oval Office, he once again said he thought I was guilty of treason, which is a crime punishable by death in the United States. And I don't take that lightly. I don't read that as just symbolic. I read that as Donald Trump urging his departments and agencies to come investigate me to find a crime, rather than the other way around, which is the way the justice system works, is when there's evidence of a crime, when there's predicate, you investigate an individual and you see if it bears out and it goes into the justice system. Instead, Donald Trump has already determined, as he did 7 years ago, that he thinks I'm guilty of treason for speaking ill of him. And so now, look, it's been massively disruptive to our lives. I'm the sole income earner in our household. I had to leave my job because it was not viable to be on a White House blacklist and doing the work that I do with various companies around the country. My wife, who's a stay-at-home mother with our baby, had to go back to work to make sure we can do things like buy formula, buy diapers, pay the bills, do the things that you have to do to survive. But the bigger fear, Jen, and one of the reasons why I think the president did this and will do this to other people, is the fear of being bankrupted by legal costs, because you have to go find lawyers to defend you. And that's really chilling. I mean, in the hour after the order dropped, my wife and I sat in the kitchen and she looked at me and said, are we going to have to get rid of the house? Are we going to have to sell the cars? Although unfortunately the value of, Teslas has gone down, that I'm not sure it would matter if I sold this car and make a difference. But that's a real conversation, because 1 hour on the phone with your lawyers is the price sometimes of a mortgage payment in a situation like this. We don't have that money. We don't have the ability to do that. And so, we're really, really lucky in our case that we had an organization called Whistleblower Aid that protected the intelligence community whistleblower from the first Trump impeachment. They came forward and they helped us, step up a legal defense fund, and they launched a fund called endpresidentialrevenge.org, END. And if it were not for them, we don't know what we would be doing right now. And I say all of this, and I'm, kind of letting you into the sort of humiliating details of the personal life here, because it's important for people to know that if you're not a Miles Taylor who's lucky enough to have a great network of supporters and friends, how would you survive this? And that is my fear here, is that they're going to turn this tool of individualized investigative EOs into something that they use just like they did with the EOs against the law firms and against universities, where they use it as leverage to go threaten people, whether it's a CEO the president doesn't like, or a nonprofit leader, or the head of some union, that the White House could potentially go to them and say, hey, the president's thinking about formally directing an investigation into you. If you want to stop that from happening, you can cut a deal with us. That is incredibly insidious. And based on what happened on April 9th, the only thing preventing the president of the United States from doing that to you right now, Jen, or anyone else, is just whether or not he has the time to scrawl his pen across a piece of paper. That is not the power that a president is supposed to have, to be able to criminalize criticism with the stroke of a pen. And so that's why Hannah and I, my wife, decided we're going to push back aggressively, because this sets a really chilling precedent when it comes to free speech to let this stand. And so we've decided to fight back.
And it hasn't just stopped with executive orders. We've seen a judge in Wisconsin, Judge Dugan, get arrested, handcuffed. We saw the mayor of New York arrested and charged. This is a deliberate pattern at this point, I think we can agree, of using the criminal justice system to target opponents, to target critics. Have you heard from any law enforcement activities? Do you know if there's an active investigation going on at this point?
Well, I know that my colleague, Chris Krebs, the Departments of Justice and Homeland Security, publicly confirmed that he was under investigation. They revoked his global entry. And that's actually how he was tipped off, is he has global entry to, fast pass back into the United States when you come back in. And he got an email notice that it had been revoked. And in pulling that thread, he finally got those agencies to admit that it's because they're carrying out this federal investigation into Chris. In my case, I actually don't have global entry. So we didn't have that same tripwire, but we found out that investigators have been calling people as far back as individuals I went to high school with, and having conversations with them. We don't really know what the purpose of this is. We've been told that all of the emails that we sent while we were in government have been ingested potentially into some AI-powered Doge system for them to assess them. I don't know for what, but they are on what the Wall Street Journal called, after this happened, a fishing expedition to see if they can find some kind of crime, to see if they can find something to hold against me. And that's just on a personal level, is a very jarring thing, to have your own government pursuing you for reasons you don't know. And folks like you and me, who've spent years warning about Donald Trump, you couldn't be more prepared for this moment than people like us. And yet you're still a person. You still trust that your government will follow the law. And then to not know if one morning you're going to wake up and four black SUVs are going to come down the driveway and they're going to ransack your house, while your wife and baby are sleeping, is look, it shoots your adrenal glands. And that's been a hard thing to grapple with. But the other thing is, Jen, and of course, charges haven't been brought yet, and all these things have happened. It's the security threat piece. And I know a lot of people talk about that, but I think it's important for people to explain how dangerous this is, because Donald Trump's investigators could decide we're not going to do anything and just give up and ignore the executive order, which I don't think is going to happen. But even if they did that, the damage is done, not just financially and professionally and personally for us, but we have dangerous individuals, including I was just on the phone a little while ago with lawyers about a stalker out on the West Coast who's been doxing family members, a MAGA individual who's been threatening us. That we have to figure out, is this real? Is this credible? Is it not? And how do you grapple with that? Because your average person cannot possibly afford how much it costs to go get restraining orders against people like that. It is tens of thousands of dollars to go hire lawyers just against one individual to get enough evidence to get a restraining order to protect your family. And even then, it's whether or not they're going to abide by that piece of paper issued by a judge. we have multiple of those situations that we're worried about right now. And that's because of the president coming out and saying something like, I think this guy's a traitor. I think he's committed treason. His supporters lap it up and they take it upon themselves to come harass you and make your life as miserable as possible. That's not okay. It's not okay for dissent to be treated like that in this country. And so we're just going to keep talking about it. I mean, we're going to keep talking about it. We're not going to shy away from it. And we're not going to let people do that to us, because I think if folks are quiet and they don't talk about that, it makes it so much easier for those bullies to come out of the woodwork and ruin people's lives.
Miles, you also took another step recently, and that was your attorney wrote a letter to two inspectors general. These are the people, some of their colleagues were fired by Donald Trump. These are the people charged with actually investigating waste, crime, and abuse. And you asked them to investigate what is going on. In other words, you've asked the investigators to investigate your own persecution. What gave you the idea to do that, and what do you expect to happen?
Um, well, first I'll say I am incredibly grateful to my attorneys, and I know there's not a lot of love lost for lawyers, but when you're in a situation like this, and you have really good legal counsel, it's the closest thing to a warm blanket that can be wrapped around
Yes.
you. I'm just really, really
Yes.
grateful for. So that team that stood up that legal defense fund, the endpresidentialrevenge.org, and other friends in this ecosystem that you and I know, helped get together a great team to think through what's the right thing for us to do in this moment. Because I could have, on April 10th, after this happened, just gone and spouted off and said, Donald Trump's a lunatic, and gotten political about it. But this isn't political anymore. This is serious. He's misusing legal tools that, who cares if you agree or disagree with Miles Taylor? This sets a precedent that a future Democratic president of the United States could start issuing revengios to investigate people for protected free speech. That's dangerous. And so my attorneys said, look, in normal times, one of the right steps to take here would be to go to the built-in government watchdogs that are supposed to sit within these agencies as independent ombudsmen to look at the activities of our departments and agencies that we all fund as taxpayers, and make sure not only that those agencies are doing their jobs and staying away from waste, fraud, and abuse, but to make sure that they're not breaking the law, to make sure they're not violating our constitutional rights. And so we submitted this letter yesterday morning to the inspectors general of the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security to ask them to open up a review into whether the people carrying out Trump's executive order into me are engaged in illegal activity, whether they're doing this as retribution for free speech and protected activity. And we believe they are. And we believe that's the type of thing that you would want the inspector general to look into, to shine a light on, and to surface whether those abuses are happening in real time, so that it doesn't happen to more people. Now, I don't know if they're going to take that up. I don't know what the answer is, but it was important to us to go test out whether that guardrail of democracy is still there before we pursue other legal options.
And this really is a test for those inspectors general. Are they simply political toadies at this point who have been intimidated by Donald Trump? Or do they take their oaths seriously? And are they actually going to follow up and do this? And I think this is one of those tests of the system, as you put it, that it's not a test for Donald Trump. It's a test for those inspectors general and for their staffs and for the permanent staff within our government as to whether they can survive the intimidation and the illegality of Donald Trump. So it's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out. I know you would rather this not be happening and you go on with your life. But we have to say at the Contrarian, we so admire what you're doing. This is what defiance, this is what defense of constitutional principles is all about. And we hope that you get some kind of response from them and that ultimately this kind of behavior ends, because we've seen how far it can go. People being arrested, people being charged, people being prosecuted. And that is not the America that you and I have known. And that's not the America you served in government. And that's not the America that Donald Trump serves. He may have have a different view of America, but that's not the America that we are. So thank you, Miles, for joining us. Thank you for what you are doing, and be strong, keep the faith, keep safe, and all our best. We'll talk to you sometime soon.
Thank you, Jen. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye.